In this video, we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. This is from Chapter 10, Campbell Biology, 9th edition. Photosynthesis converts solar energy or light energy into chemical energy. It directly or indirectly, photosynthesis nourishes almost the entire living world. Either animals eat plants or animals eat animals that have eaten plants. And that's typically the way a food chain goes. So photosynthesis is always going to supply the basis of all the energy that we have in any given system. We talked about that in Chapter 8 a little bit. We talked about it in Chapter 9 for sure, that all energy enters a system through photosynthesis. It enters the system through solar energy or sunlight energy. Autotrophs are organisms that can feed themselves by using photosynthesis or some other chemical process where they produce their own food. Autotrophs are producers. Producers is another word that basically means the exact same thing. They're organisms that can produce their own energy. Most of the organisms that we're familiar with are photoautotrophs. The plants, algae, cyanobacteria, which are also referred to as blue-green algae, but cyanobacteria is a better term for these particular organisms. They're prokaryotic cells that can undergo photosynthesis and produce their own food. So plants, algae, certain protists, and some prokaryotes are the kinds of organisms that we consider to be producers or autotrophs. Heterotrophs are just the opposite of autotrophs. They obtain their organic material from other organisms. They are the consumers. Typically we think of animals, but there are lots of other organisms like fungi and certain protists that are considered to be heterotrophs. Now, in this particular section, we're going to talk about chloroplasts. Chloroplasts, we learned in several chapters ago, Chapter 6. Chloroplasts are the functional unit, the organelle, in eukaryotic cells where photosynthesis takes place. So a chloroplast has all the chemicals needed in one place, all the membranes, all the proteins, all the enzymes needed for photosynthesis to take place. We can have photosynthesis in prokaryotic cells. It's just not as organized, and they don't have a good space for that. It just happens within their cytoplasm. So leaves are the major place where we talk about photosynthesis. Their green color comes from a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the main pigment of photosynthesis. Chlorophyll is found in chloroplasts. And when we talk about chlorophyll, it's going to be found in the membranes of the thylakoid. When we look at the way a chloroplast is put together, which we will in just a minute, there is an inner membrane. It's not all folded up like we see in mitochondria, but it definitely has a structure to it, and those structures, each of those membranes is referred to as a thylakoid or a thylakoid membrane. There's also a liquid portion to the chloroplast. It's referred to as the stroma. And so certain reactions with photosynthesis occur in the thylakoids, and certain reactions occur within the stroma. So when we look at the structure of chloroplast, we can see a little bit better on this diagram how it's labeled. Each individual part of the stack, if we're looking at that big stack of materials, and there's several stacks, each individual part is called a thylakoid, and then collectively the thylakoids, when they're stacked on top of each other, are referred to as granum. Granum is singular, grana is the plural, but often we kind of use those interchangeably. Well, the open liquid portion is the stroma, so we can see that the chloroplast is a double membrane structure. It has an outer membrane, and then its inner membrane is all folded up to help produce the thylakoids in those stacks of grana. Be familiar with the structure of chloroplast, just like you should be familiar with the structure of mitochondria. Here's the balanced equation for photosynthesis. You should definitely be familiar with balanced equations. 6CO2 plus 12H2O. In the presence of light energy, I personally would not put that as a plus, but I usually put that over the arrow because it's definitely needed for photosynthesis. I personally would not call it a reactant since it isn't a chemical, but you definitely have to have light energy in order for photosynthesis to occur. We make C6H12O6, or I should say plants make C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus they make 6 oxygens and they make 6 water molecules. Now, for some of you who have a chemistry background, you would say there's something wrong with that balanced equation because we have water on both sides, so why don't we just reduce that? Well, that's a really good question. The reason we don't reduce the water on both sides is because the water molecules that we start with are not the water molecules that we end with. We totally break down the 12 water molecules that go into photosynthesis, and we're going to create 6 brand new water molecules. So that's why we have water on both sides of the equation, is because the reactant water is not the same water as the product water. So this is a more accurate picture of what happens in photosynthesis. Now, the splitting of water is really important. It's the first major step in what happens in photosynthesis. Chloroplast splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. We really have to split it into hydrogen ions and oxygen ions. Hydrogen ions we leave as ions, and oxygen ions are going to combine together to make atmospheric O2, and that's going to be released by the plant. So oxygen is actually considered a byproduct or a waste product of the process of photosynthesis, but we know that it's very important for the process of cellular respiration. The main thing that we really want out of that water is the electrons. We like those hydrogen ions, and we really want those electrons because electrons contain a large amount of energy, and those electrons release that energy as we pull those electrons out of chlorophyll that's becoming energized by the solar energy that's hitting those chloroplasts. Here we see what happens overall. The carbon from CO2 is incorporated into the glucose. The oxygen from CO2 is incorporated into both the glucose and into water. The hydrogen is incorporated into both glucose and water, and the oxygen from water is incorporated into the O2 that is released by the plant. Photosynthesis is pretty much the opposite of cellular respiration. It says here it reverses the direction of electron flow, and we're still going to have electrons flowing, but we're going to build up the energy in a chemical called glucose. Well, probably glucose. So we actually build it up into a chemical called G3P. We'll get to that in a little bit, or in the next video. But photosynthesis is overall a redox process. Cellular respiration overall was oxidation, and photosynthesis is a redox process, just like the whole part of photosynthesis. When we look at the whole structure of what happens in cellular respiration, then they're both redox reactions. All right, and in this redox reaction, the water molecules are oxidized, and we make oxygen. Can't be more oxidized than that. And CO2 is reduced. We're going to incorporate more electrons with CO2 and with hydrogen ions, and we're going to create an organic molecule, an organic sugar. Photosynthesis overall is an endergonic process, and we build up energy within the process, and that energy boost comes from the light energy, the solar energy that is collected in the chloroplasts. So here we show that the CO2 is reduced and the water is oxidized. There are two major stages to photosynthesis. There are the light reactions. That's the photo part of photosynthesis, since photo means light. And then we have what's called the Calvin cycle. That's the synthesis part, and that's where we're going to make our organic sugar compound. The light reactions occur in the thylakoids, and the major events are we split water, we release oxygen, we reduce NADP, which is an electron carrier, into NADPH, and then we generate some ATP, but then we're actually going to turn around and use that NADPH, and we're going to reuse that ATP and they are just cyclical within the process. We make them, break them down, make them, break them down, and they're not considered products because they are broken down in the process. So we're going to stop this video here, and we're going to pick back up with the 2 stages of photosynthesis in part 2 of chapter 10, Campbell Biology, 9th edition.